I am Jeanne d'Arc, though you know me as Joan of Arc. Let me tell you my story, not as legends tell it, but as I lived it. I was born in Domrémy, a village on the border between France and Burgundy, in 1412. To understand my story, you must understand what France was then. A kingdom torn apart, with the English controlling the north, the Burgundians allied with them, and our true king, the Dauphin Charles, holding only the land south of the Loire. My childhood was simple. I helped my father Jacques tend his fields, learned spinning and sewing from my mother Isabel, and prayed with a devotion that made our priest smile. We were neither rich nor poor. My father owned his own land and served as village headman, but war touched everyone. More than once, we had to flee to the nearby fortress town of Neufchâteau when raiders came. I was 13 when I first heard the voices. Saint Michael appeared to me in a blaze of light, then Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. They told me France must be saved, and that I was chosen for this task. I was terrified. What could a peasant girl do to save France? But the voices were insistent, becoming clearer and more frequent over time. For 4 years I kept this secret, telling no one but our parish priest, while the voices taught me. They showed me visions of battles I would fight, told me France's suffering must end, instructed me in things a peasant girl should not know: strategy, warfare, the secret science by which I would prove myself to the Dauphin. My father tried to arrange a marriage for me. I refused. When he had dreams of me riding with soldiers, he told my brothers, "If I thought this would happen, I would tell you to drown her." But no earthly authority could override the divine mission I had been given. Finally, in 1428, the voices became urgent. "Go to France," they said, meaning the French-held territories. "Race the siege of Orléans. Take the Dauphin to be crowned at Reims." When I protested that I was a poor girl who could neither ride nor fight, they responded, "It is God who commands it." My uncle Durand Laxart helped me reach Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. At first, Baudricourt laughed and told my uncle to take me home and slap me. But I persisted, and events proved my prophecies true. When I told him exactly how the French had lost a battle near Orléans before news could have reached us, he began to listen. I cut my hair short and donned men's clothing, not from choice but necessity. A woman traveling through war-torn lands would face dangers worse than death. The voices approved, telling me this garb would protect both my mission and my purity. Baudricourt finally gave me an escort, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, who would become my loyal companions. He gave me a sword and a letter to the Dauphin. As I left Vaucouleurs, he said, "Go then, and let come what may." I replied, "Indeed, I am sent by the King of Heaven." The journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court, took 11 days through enemy territory. We traveled mostly at night, sleeping in churches when we could find them. I had never ridden before, but the voices gave me strength. When my companions expressed amazement at how well I rode, I said simply, "My voices taught me." Would you hear how I proved myself to the Dauphin? How a peasant girl convinced a prince to trust her with his army? The story becomes both stranger and more miraculous from here. Remember, as I tell this tale, that I never claimed to be anything but God's messenger. The voices guided me, gave me strength, showed me the path, but the choices and the consequences were always mine. I was 17 years old, unable to read or write. knowing nothing of war or politics. But I knew with absolute certainty that God had chosen me to save France. Whether you believe this came from divine inspiration or something else matters less than what followed. The voices still speak to me, even now. They tell me to share this story truly, both the glories and the pains. Shall I continue with how I met the Dauphin and began my mission to save France? The tale grows both more amazing and more terrible from here. The Dauphin's court at Chinon was my first test. They tried to trick me. Charles hid among his courtiers, having another man sit on his throne. But my voices guided me straight to him. I knelt before him, saying, "Gentle Dauphin, I am Jeanne the maid, sent by God to aid you in the kingdom of France." I told him a secret then, something only he could know. A private prayer he had made to God. The color drained from his face. Later, people would ask what I said, but I would never tell. Some secrets belong only to God and the souls who share them. The court was divided over me. The Dauphin's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, supported me immediately. She understood that in desperate times, God might well choose unlikely instruments. But others were suspicious. A peasant girl claiming divine guidance. It seemed either heresy or madness. They sent me to Poitiers to be examined by theologians. For 3 weeks they questioned me. If God wishes to save France, they asked, why does he need soldiers? I replied, the soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory. When they demanded a sign, I told them, I did not come to Poitiers to show signs. Take me to Orléans. There you will see the sign I was sent to give. The Inquisition was thorough. They sent women to verify my virginity, a sign of divine favor in those days. They questioned my wearing of men's clothes, but I explained it was necessary for my mission and to protect myself among soldiers. They searched for signs of witchcraft or heresy. Finally, they could find no evil in me. My armor was made to measure, white enameled plate that shone like silver. The Dauphin's government paid for it, though they could barely afford it. They gave me a war horse and a banner of my own design, white field with fleur-de-lis, showing Jesus blessing the world, with angels at his sides and the words, Jesus, Maria. But the sword, that was special. My voices told me it would be found buried behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, marked with 5 crosses. When they looked where I directed, they found it exactly as I had described. I had never been to that church. This miracle convinced many who still doubted. I gathered my army at Blois. Professional soldiers were skeptical of a teenage girl commanding them, but I instituted changes immediately. No swearing, no looting, no camp followers. Every man had to confess before fighting. Some grumbled, but most were impressed by my conviction. Besides, they had seen their own tactics fail for years. What did they have to lose? My battle standard became more important to me than my sword, as I told them later at my trial. I loved my banner 40 times more than my sword. When attacking, I carried the banner myself to avoid killing anyone. I never killed in battle. The voices forbade it. I led, inspired, strategized, but never shed blood. The army that gathered was a strange mix. Hardened mercenaries alongside fresh recruits, noble knights next to common soldiers. I made them all attend mass together, pray together, fight together. Unity under God was our strength. The English might have better trained soldiers, but we had divine purpose. Let me tell you about La Hire. one of my best captains, a fierce warrior who used to swear terribly. He modified his oaths for me to buy my baton. When I made him pray, he said, "God, do for Lahia what Lahia would do for you if you were Lahia and Lahia were God." His simple faith touched me more than any learned theologians. We prepared to march to Orléans. The city had been under siege for months, a stranglehold that would decide France's fate. If Orléans fell, nothing would stop the English from taking the rest of France. My voices had been clear. This was where I would prove my divine mission. The hardened warriors who had initially scoffed at a peasant girl commanding them began to see something different in me. I could spot hidden English positions, predict their movements, know things about warfare I had never learned. When asked how, I simply said, "My voices tell me." My letter to the English commanders showed both my divine mission and my determination. Surrender to the maid sent by God, the King of Heaven. Give back to France what you have taken, or I will raise such a war cry as has not been heard in France for 1,000 years. Would you hear how we broke the siege of Orléans? How God's will was made manifest through a peasant girl leading hardened soldiers. The story becomes both more glorious and more terrible from here. Remember, as I tell this tale, that everything I did was guided by my voices. Whether you believe they were divine or not, their guidance never failed me in battle. It was only when others ignored their wisdom that disasters occurred. Orléans was the key to France. The English had besieged it for 7 months, building fortified towers around the city. If Orléans fell, the Loire Valley would be open to them, and France would be lost. My voices had been clear. This was where God's will would be shown. I entered the city at night on April 29th, 1429, riding a white horse. My standard held high. The people of Orléans lined the streets, trying to touch my armor, my horse, even my boots. They saw me as their miracle, their salvation. Their faith would prove justified, though not in ways anyone expected. The English commander, Lord Talbot, had built his siege fortifications well, a ring of strongholds called bastilles around the city. Traditional military wisdom said we should wait, gather more forces. But my voices were insistent. We must attack immediately. My first action shocked everyone. Instead of an attack, I sent the English a letter demanding they leave France. They responded with insults, calling me a cowgirl and worse. Their herald told me they would burn me if they caught me. I wept, not from fear, but because they rejected the chance God gave them to leave peacefully. The battle began at the Bastille of Saint-Lô. I had been resting when my voices woke me, telling me blood was being shed. I rode out to find our forces had attacked without telling me. By the time I arrived, they were retreating. I raised my standard, shouted, "In God's name, forward!" and led a new charge. The fortress fell within hours. 3 days later, we took the Bastille of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc. The English abandoned it as we approached, but it was still a victory. More importantly, our soldiers were beginning to believe. They saw me stand fearless under English arrows, saw how I always knew where to attack, when to press forward, when to fall back. The decisive battle came at the fortress of Les Tourelles. This was their strongest position, guarding the southern bridge into Orléans. Our assault began at dawn. I was everywhere that day, rallying troops, positioning artillery, encouraging the fearful. Around midday, an English crossbow bolt struck me above the breast, emerging through my back. They carried me from the field, but I saw our soldiers beginning to retreat. I prayed briefly, then pulled the arrow out myself. My voices assured me I would not die, not before my mission was complete. Within 15 minutes, I was back on my horse, raising my standard. When the soldiers saw me return from what should have been a fatal wound, their courage redoubled. As evening approached, it seemed we would fail. Our commanders wanted to retreat, to try again another day, but my voices were clear. We must press on. I called for one final assault, led it myself. A scaling ladder was raised against the walls. I climbed first, calling into the fortress, "Everything is yours." An English archer shot me in the foot with an arrow. Still, I kept climbing. Others followed. The English commander, Glassdale, who had called me whore and threatened to burn me, fell into the Loire when a cannon shot destroyed his escape route. I cried out, "Glassdale, Glassdale, surrender to the King of Heaven. You called me whore, but I have great pity for your soul." Les Tourelles fell as the sun set. That night, the English burned their remaining fortresses and retreated. The siege that had lasted 7 months was broken in 4 days. The miracle was complete. But miracles have consequences. The English would never admit they had been defeated by a peasant girl. It had to be witchcraft. And some French nobles were already jealous of my influence with the king. Success would prove as dangerous as failure. The people of Orléans treated me like a saint. They rang the cathedral bells all night, sang Te Deum in the churches, feasted in the streets. I participated briefly, then retired to pray. My voices told me this was only the beginning. They were right. Orléans was just the first step. Next, we had to clear the Loire Valley of English strongholds, then take the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. The real challenges and the real miracles were still to come. Would you hear how we accomplished these things? How a peasant girl led an army across enemy territory to crown a king? The story becomes even more extraordinary, though it moves now toward its tragic end. Remember, as I tell this tale, that everything I did was guided by my voices. At Orléans, they never failed me. Later, when men chose to ignore their wisdom, disaster would follow. But for now, we were living in a time of miracles, when God's will was made manifest through the most unlikely instrument, a teenage girl who could neither read nor write. After Orléans, my mission was clear. Take the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. But Reims lay deep in English-held territory. The journey would require us to capture several enemy strongholds and cross nearly 200 leagues of hostile land. The Loire campaign came first. We took Chargeau on June 12th, with me leading the final assault. During the battle, I warned the Duke of Alençon to move from a spot where I knew a cannon would fire. Moments later, the cannon killed a man standing where he had been. Such foreknowledge from my voices was common, though it still amazed our soldiers. Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency fell next. Then came Patay, our greatest victory yet. Unlike previous battles, this was open field combat. I told our commanders exactly where to find the English army and how to engage them. The resulting battle was a slaughter. The English lost 2,000 men. We lost only 3. Lord Talbot himself was captured. But politics began interfering with divine mission. The Dauphin's advisors, especially Georges de la Trémoille, feared my growing influence. They counseled delay, suggesting we strengthen our position in the Loire Valley instead of marching to Reims. My voices were adamant. Any delay served the enemy. I confronted Charles directly. Gentle Dauphin, do not hold such long and drawn-out councils. Come quickly to Reims to receive your rightful crown." When he hesitated, I added, "I shall not last much more than a year. Think to use me well, for that is all the time I have." We finally began the march to Reims on June 29th, with an army of 12,000 men. The English and Burgundians could have gathered forces to stop us, but they seemed paralyzed by our momentum. City after city surrendered as we approached. Troyes, which had a strong garrison, capitulated after seeing me prepare for battle. Reims itself surrendered without a fight. On July 17th, 1429, I stood beside the high altar of Reims Cathedral as Charles VII was crowned King of France. "My standard had been through the struggle," I said later. "It deserved to share in the victory." For this brief moment, my divine mission seemed complete. But my voices gave me no rest. There was more to do. Paris must be retaken. France must be completely freed. The newly crowned king, however, preferred diplomacy. He began negotiations with Burgundy, ignoring my warnings that they were stalling for time to reinforce Paris. The attack on Paris came too late, with too little support. On September 8th, I led an assault on the Saint-Honoré gate. A crossbow bolt struck my thigh as I was measuring the depth of the moat. Still, I kept calling for the advance until darkness fell. When they carried me from the field, I was still shouting, "The place can be taken." But Charles had already decided to retreat to the Loire. He signed a truce with Burgundy that gave away everything we had gained. My voices raged against this decision. But for the first time, I was powerless to enforce their will. This was my first real defeat, and it changed everything. Some began questioning whether my voices had abandoned me. Others suggested God had only blessed me for the coronation, not for further conquests. The king's advisors used these doubts to undermine my influence. Would you hear what followed? How betrayal and capture led to my trial and death. The story grows darker here, though my voices never left me, even at the end. Remember, I had prophesied that I would last little more than a year. The glorious part of my mission was ending. What remained would test not my courage in battle, but my faith in the face of abandonment and death. My capture came at Compiègne on May 23rd, 1430. I led a sortie against the Burgundian forces besieging the city. During the retreat, I stayed with the rearguard, protecting our soldiers. The town's drawbridge was raised too soon. Whether by accident or treachery, I never knew. I was pulled from my horse by a Burgundian archer. The Burgundians sold me to the English for 10,000 livres, a king's ransom. They took me to Rouen, English-controlled Normandy's capital, and kept me in a military tower, not a church prison, as required for ecclesiastical trials. My guards were English soldiers, not nuns, as church law demanded for female prisoners. They kept me in chains, housed like a beast. My voices sustained me, though they had warned this would come. "Take everything in good grace," they said. "Do not fear your martyrdom. You will enter paradise." The trial began January 9th, 1431. Bishop Pierre Cauchon presided, a Burgundian supporter chosen by the English. They denied me legal counsel, saying a divinely inspired maid needed no lawyers. Every word was a trap. When they asked if I was in God's grace, I replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Even the hostile judges marveled at this answer. For months, they questioned me about everything. My voices, my standard, my male clothing, My military campaigns. They transcribed my answers in French, then mistranslated them to Latin to make me appear heretical. But my voices guided my responses. Answer boldly, they said. God will help you? The male clothing became central to their case. I wore it for practical reasons: protection from assault in prison, necessity in military campaigns. They claimed it violated divine law. When I said my voices approved it, they called this proof of demonic influence. They denied me the Mass and sacraments, hoping to break my spirit. My voices remained my only comfort. They tried to make me deny them, to say they were demons or imagination. I refused. Everything I've done was at God's command, I told them. My voices have never deceived me. On May 24th, 1431, they took me to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. They had a stake ready, with executioners waiting. Threatened with immediate burning, exhausted and confused, I signed an abjuration I couldn't read. They gave me a woman's dress and returned me to prison. But my voices reproached me for this weakness. When the English guards tried to rape me, I put my male clothing back on. This relapse was all they needed. Cauchon condemned me as a relapse heretic. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they led me to the old marketplace of Rouen. I was 19 years old. I asked for a cross. A sympathetic English soldier made one from 2 sticks. I clutched it as they tied me to the stake. The flames rose. I cried out, "Jesus! Jesus!" until the end. They heard me name my voices, saw me bow my head calling Jesus one final time. A secretary to the English king ran from the scene crying, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." They burned my body 3 times to prevent any relics, then threw my ashes into the Seine. They feared my power even in death, but they couldn't destroy my legacy. 25 years later, Charles VII, the king I had crowned, ordered an investigation that cleared my name. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized me as a saint. The girl they had burned as a heretic became one of France's patron saints. My story ends there, but its meaning continues. I was an illiterate peasant girl who changed history, led armies, crowned a king. My voices never failed me, even at the stake. Whether you believe they were divine or not, my faith in them never wavered. Remember me not as a saint or a warrior, but as a maid who answered when God called. I did not choose my fate. It chose me. All I did was remain faithful to the end. They could burn my body, but not my spirit. France was freed, as my voices promised, and my name lives on, not as witch or heretic, but as Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the maid, who lit a flame of hope that even death could not extinguish.